The Rothwell Lounge breathed money. Crystal chimed against porcelain with the lightness of people who never checked their bank apps. A thin jazz line drifted from somewhere unseen, soft as a promise made for show. The air carried aged Bordeaux, saffron risotto, and inherited confidence, layered over the faint bite of sanitizer that never quite left a busy dining room. Aaliyah Vance moved through it like a structural beam nobody thanked. She balanced a tray of champagne flutes with both hands, keeping her wrists steady while heat climbed up her forearms. The collar of her white shirt pressed too tight across her shoulders. She had bought it a year ago when she still told herself this job was temporary, like a bad season that would pass if she just kept walking. Her shoes were scuffed, polyurethane knockoffs that had started to split at the seams. The right sole had peeled enough that every crossing of the kitchen threshold let in a thin lick of dampness. The carpet in the dining room hid the sound of her steps, but she still felt the drag of worn tread, the quiet scrape of something giving up. Near the sommelier station, Victor Thorne watched the floor as if it were a battlefield and hesitation was treason. He stood straight, tie perfect, eyes moving over the tables with the cold attention of a man who believed wealth was the only god that ever answered prayers. Table 3 needs their duck-carved tableside, Victor said without looking at her. Table 5 is complaining the truffle shavings are too thin. Move, Vance, move. Right away, Victor, Aaliyah said. Her voice stayed level. She had learned to keep it level even when her lower back burned and her calves trembled. The evening service was reaching its crescendo, the time when the room grew louder and sharper at once. Laughter popped from table to table like expensive corks. A man in a navy suit at one table leaned back as though the chair had been built for his spine alone. A woman in diamonds lifted her glass and talked with her hands, the stones catching candlelight and throwing it around like confetti. Aaliyah passed the kitchen doors and the damp air brushed her ankles. She adjusted the tray, breathed through the ache, and let her face settle into the practiced smile she wore like armor. Warm enough to feel sincere, distant enough to remain forgettable. Victor's gaze cut toward the entrance. A dark-haired man in a bespoke suit had just stepped inside with the posture of someone who had never waited for a table in his life. The hostess greeted him with a brightness that bordered on fear. The woman beside him wore rose-colored silk and ruby earrings that caught the light every time she turned her head, as if she were trying to disappear by being flawless. Toby, 19 and still dazzled by proximity, materialized at Aaliyah's elbow with a water pitcher. His whisper came out too loud, as though he could not help himself. "That's Julian Blackwood," he said. "He's like $3 billion. Hedge fund. He was on the cover of Forbes last month." Aaliyah's smile did not move. "Wonderful," she murmured, and kept walking. Sasha at the bar caught Aaliyah's wrist as she passed, her Russian accent thickening with sympathy. "Good luck," she said. "That one sent back 6 bottles last month. Said our 2009 Bordeaux tasted like bourgeois desperation." Direct quote. Aaliyah freed her wrist gently. The glass stem in her hand was warm from her palm. She felt sweat gather between her shoulder blades and ignored it. Julian Blackwood settled into table 7 as if he were settling into ownership. He did not pull out Elena's chair. He sat first, adjusting his cuff as though the room were late, not him. Elena sat with a small pause, as if checking whether she had permission to take up space. Aaliyah approached with menus. The leather covers were clean, heavy, and slightly cool, a texture designed to reassure people that nothing in this room was cheap or fragile. She laid the menus down with precision. Her eyes caught the way Julian's gaze traveled. Name tag. Shoes. Back to her face. The journey took only a few seconds, but she felt the assessment land like a hand, measured, dismissed, filed away as background. "Good evening," Aaliyah began, voice neutral and controlled. "Welcome to the Rothwell Lounge. May I start you with something from our—" Julian did not look up from the wine list. He lifted one finger, a small gesture that told her to wait. It was practiced, casual, and cruel in its efficiency. Aaliyah held her position. She kept her shoulders down. She kept the tray balanced in her mind even though her hands were empty now. Waiting was part of the job. Waiting was how people like Julian reminded people like her who belonged where. The jazz line continued. Forks clinked. A laugh burst near the window and faded. Then Julian spoke. The words were unfamiliar to most ears, sharp and elegant at once, shaped with exaggerated care. as if he were reciting something rare for an audience. The syllables rolled out in an archaic Provençal dialect that did not belong in a modern dining room, a linguistic relic dropped onto the table like a blade. Conversation around them thinned. A woman at the neighboring table paused mid-sentence, lips parting on a word she decided not to finish. Someone's fork stopped halfway to their mouth. At the bar, Sasha's hand froze on a bottle, the pour suspended in the air. Near the kitchen pass, Marcel set down his knife with a soft, final tap, and the sound carried because the room had gone so careful. Elena's smile faltered. She shifted in her seat, fingers tightening around her stemware. Her eyes flicked to Aaliyah with apology that never reached action. Julian leaned back, satisfied. A smirk pressed at the corners of his mouth, small but unmistakable. He had built this moment for effect, a performance meant to isolate her in front of his fiancée, in front of the room, in front of the kind of money that believed humiliation could be purchased the same way as truffles. He waited for confusion, for stammering, for an apology, for her to fetch someone more qualified and vanish back into the architecture. Aaliyah felt every eye that had turned toward her, the weight of a room suddenly aware she existed only as a potential joke. She heard Victor's voice in her head like a metronome. "No mistakes. This is money." Her right heel pulsed as dampness seeped through the split sole. The carpet hid the scrape of her worn shoes, but she could feel them anyway, the softness beneath her feet like a lie. At table 4, a gray-haired gentleman lowered his newspaper by an inch. He did not look up fully. He did not need to. His hand, steady and unhurried, folded the paper along a clean crease. The movement was quiet, almost polite. Alaya's mouth was still closed. Her expression stayed professional. Her hands remained at her sides. The room held its breath without knowing it. Julian's smirk widened a fraction, as if he could taste the moment before it happened. He thought she was a backdrop. He thought he was untouchable. He waited for her to break. Aaliyah did not move right away. The air felt thinner near table 7, as if the room itself had learned to hold its breath. Her tongue pressed lightly against her teeth, tasting metal from adrenaline she refused to show. Julian's eyes stayed on her face, bright with the expectation of collapse. She let one beat pass, then another. Her gaze flicked, quick and controlled, toward the edge of the dining room where Victor stood near the host's stand. He was watching like a man watching stock prices drop, already deciding what could be sacrificed to stop the bleeding. Aaliyah could see the calculation in the tightness of his jaw. She could almost hear the sentence forming behind his teeth. Apologize. Fix it. Disappear. Her fingers curled once at her side and released. The muscles in her forearm ached from carrying weight all night, but her hands stayed steady. She made herself inhale through her nose. Bordeaux, saffron, expensive perfume. Under it, the faint sour note of damp tile that clung to her split soul. The smell of work that never left her, no matter how clean her shirt looked. He doesn't know she studied that dialect professionally, down to its breath and bone. The thought landed cleanly and without drama, like a fact written in ink. Julian had no idea what he had dragged into the light for entertainment. Aaliyah's face stayed neutral, but inside her chest, something shifted, an old, familiar shape waking up. Not anger, not pride, something sharper. Something that had once belonged to lecture halls and late nights and paper cuts from archival documents. Her mind flashed, fast and uninvited, to a different room. Cold marble floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed softly, a voice reading prices like punishments. Physical therapy, medication, care. Numbers that never stopped climbing. Her father's left hand slack in her right, heavier than it should have been, as if gravity had singled him out. The image sharpened into a single object. A thin envelope on her kitchen counter in Queens, the paper softened at the corners from being handled too often. In her own handwriting, 2 words in thick marker, Dad Fund. There was no romance in it, no symbolism, just survival, scraped together in crumpled bills and coins that smelled like sweat and dish soap. The last count had been small enough to make her throat tighten. She could feel it now, even though it wasn't here, an invisible weight waiting for her when she got home. If she lost this job, the envelope stayed thin. If the envelope stayed thin, her father stayed where he was, in a place that smelled like bleach and resignation, where bells rang too long before anyone answered. Aaliyah's throat tightened once. She swallowed it down. Across from her, Elena's fingers traced the stem of her glass without lifting it. Her shoulders sat too high, tension disguised as elegance. She looked at Aaliyah again, an apology that kept failing to become a word. Julian's smirk held. It wasn't even aimed at Elena anymore. It was aimed at the room, at the idea that he could bend someone into a shape he found pleasing. Aaliyah's eyes dropped to the wineglass on the table, the way candlelight fractured through the bowl. She adjusted it by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the edge of the place setting, as if the smallest order in the world could anchor her. The bass clicked softly against the tablecloth. That sound seemed to travel. At the bar, Sasha's suspended pour resumed in a thin, careful stream. The bottleneck glinted. In the kitchen pass, Marcel's hands went back to work, but slower, waiting. Aaliyah lifted her gaze. Not to challenge, to focus. Julian had used an extinct dialect like jewelry, a way to glitter while cutting. But language was not decoration to her. It was structure. It was history. It was power that could be used cleanly or used dirty. And he had chosen dirty. Victor took one step forward, then stopped himself, caught between fear of a scene and fear of the man causing it. His lips parted as if to speak. He didn't. The silence was its own kind of instruction. Aaliyah's phone vibrated once against her thigh inside her apron, a small insect buzz. She did not reach for it. She did not look down. The vibration stopped, then started again. 2 short pulses, urgent. Her stomach clenched. No one messaged her twice during service unless something was wrong. But Julian was still watching, waiting, demanding her attention the way he demanded everything. Aaliyah kept her eyes on him. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to let the split sole betray her with a wet squeak. Her heel throbbed, but she held. He doesn't know. Not the language, not the years, not the way she could answer him without flinching. And he definitely didn't know what it would cost her to stay invisible tonight. The phone buzzed a third time, longer. She allowed herself a single glance downward, just enough to confirm the screen's pale glow through the fabric of her apron. A name flashed in the corner of her vision. Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor. Aaliyah's pulse jolted hard against her ribs. Her fingers tightened around nothing. She forced them to relax. She couldn't take the call. Not here. Not with Julian performing cruelty like a hobby and a room full of money pretending not to see. She looked back up. Her expression remained composed, but the temperature in her eyes changed, turning colder, steadier. The kind of steadiness that came from knowing exactly what was at stake. Julian's smirk flickered, almost imperceptible, as if he sensed the shift and disliked it. He opened his mouth again, ready to press, to repeat, to make sure she felt small. Aaliyah's lips parted slightly. Not yet, but soon. At table 4, the gray-haired gentleman's hand moved again, a slow, controlled motion. He set his folded newspaper down with deliberate care, the paper whispering against the linen like a door closing. The jazz line continued, but it seemed farther away now. Aaliyah held Julian's gaze. Then she spoke, her voice calm enough to be mistaken for obedience, and asked, "Would you like me to repeat that back to you, sir?" The room stayed still, caught on the edge of whatever came next. Victor Thorne appeared beside Aaliyah with the timing of a man who could smell trouble before it reached the table. His smile was shaped for guests, but his eyes were not. They flicked once to Julian, once to Elena, then back to Aaliyah as if she were a lever he intended to pull. "Table 7, Victor murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Handle them personally. No mistakes." Aaliyah kept her posture straight. The dampness under her right heel cooled as it spread. "Understood," she said. "I mean it, Vance. These aren't tourists. This is money." He said money like it was weather, like it could ruin a night if you didn't respect it. Aaliyah turned back toward the table. Julian sat with his wine list open, letting the silence stretch as long as it pleased him. Elena's shoulders were still tense. Her fingers had stopped tracing the stem of her glass. Now they rested on the tablecloth as if she needed to feel something solid. Philip, the sommelier, approached with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades turning suggestions into deference. He stopped at Julian's shoulder. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. May I suggest?" "No." Julian didn't look up. The word was clean and dismissive. A small cut delivered with a smile he didn't bother to show. Philip's expression froze for a heartbeat, then reset. Of course, sir. Julian's finger tapped the wine list once, impatient, like knocking on a door he owned. Bring me the reserve, and don't offer me mediocre substitutes. The phrasing carried a deliberate sting, not simply a preference, a hierarchy. Philip's jaw tightened slightly, then he dipped his head. His accent sharpened when he answered, a subtle edge slipping into his otherwise smooth professionalism. Certainly, sir. Elena leaned toward Julian, her voice quiet, careful. That was a bit much. Julian finally looked at her, eyes cool. I'm paying $400 for wine. I shouldn't have to educate the staff. He turned back to the list as if the conversation was over. Elena's lips pressed together. She said nothing after that. Aaliyah watched the exchange from a polite distance, holding her notepad at her waist. Her phone sat like a stone in her apron pocket, but she refused to touch it again. Everything inside her wanted to know what Mrs. Higgins had been calling about. Her father's name hovered at the edge of her thoughts like a bruise you couldn't stop pressing. She stepped forward, offering her service with the same measured tone she always used. May I answer any questions about the menu this evening? Julian's gaze lifted to her, slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her face first. He looked at her name tag, then down again, the same quick inventory of worth. The corners of his mouth rose, almost amused, as if he'd remembered there was still a performance to complete. He paused a moment longer, making her stand there. The room's jazz kept playing, soft and indifferent, but the silence at table 7 began to pull attention anyway. Nearby, diners instinctively lowered their voices, curiosity drawn by the scent of tension. Julian's eyes narrowed, playful in a way that felt predatory. He spoke again, not in modern French this time, but in that archaic Provençal cadence, careful, affected, chosen to be heard. He asked about oysters as if it were a riddle, as if her answer would entertain him either way. Elena's head dipped slightly, embarrassment warming her cheeks. She didn't reach for Julian's hand. She didn't correct him. Her silence sat between them like a third person. Aaliyah felt Victor watching from the host's stand. She didn't have to look to know. He would be thinking in numbers, in reputational risk, in tips and review sites and wealthy complaints that could cascade into lost reservations. He would be wondering whether a waitress was worth the anger of a billionaire. Julian leaned back, letting his question hang. His smirk sharpened. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to apologize for not being educated enough to understand his showpiece cruelty. Aaliyah's throat tightened once. She took a breath through her nose, tasting saffron and wine and the faint sourness of damp tile that had followed her onto the carpet. She kept her expression neutral, her posture composed, as if her body were not a battleground. At the bar, Sasha had stopped wiping glasses. Her hands rested on the cloth, motionless. Toby hovered 2 tables away with a pitcher, frozen in a half-step, eyes wide. In the kitchen pass, Marcel's head lifted. He didn't need translation to understand the intent. He understood tone. He understood humiliation when it came dressed in grammar. Aaliyah opened her notepad slowly, buying time with ritual. Paper whispered. The pen clicked once. Tiny sounds became loud in a room that had gone attentive. Julian's eyes flicked to the pen, then back to her face. He looked pleased with himself, as if he were watching a slow trap close. Aaliyah met his gaze without warmth, without hostility. Just focus. The air around them felt sharpened, the way air feels just before glass breaks. Elena's eyes moved to Aaliyah, and for the first time there was something else there besides apology. A question, a hope she seemed ashamed to admit. Julian's smirk held steady, waiting for the stumble that would confirm his worldview. Aaliyah's lips parted. Before she could answer, Victor's voice cut in from behind her, too bright, too eager. Miss Vance will take excellent care of you, Mr. Blackwood. Our service is unmatched. Julian didn't acknowledge Victor. He didn't need to. He already had what he wanted, a stage, an audience, and a woman he assumed would shrink. Aaliyah felt her pulse steady into something colder. She lowered her gaze for a fraction of a second, not in submission, but in control, like a conductor checking the first note before the orchestra began. When she lifted her eyes again, her expression was calm enough to unsettle. Julian's smile faltered, just slightly, as if he sensed the ground shift under his polished shoes. Aaliyah inhaled once more, deeper this time, and her voice when it came was quiet but clear. "All right," she said, softly, as if agreeing to a request. And then she began to answer him. Aaliyah's first words landed with the calm of a blade laid flat on velvet. She answered in Old Provençal, not hesitating, not searching. The vowels sat perfectly in her mouth, measured and warm, the kind of fluency that wasn't borrowed for effect. The cadence was steady, almost gentle, like a teacher correcting a bright student who had gotten careless. Julian's smirk held for half a second longer, out of habit. Then it faltered. Aaliyah continued, still in Provençal, giving him exactly what he had asked for: freshness, origin, delivery without the slightest tremor. Her tone stayed polite, not deferential, not performative, just precise. The room stayed unnaturally still, as if everyone had leaned in at once. At the edge of the dining area, the jazz line thinned, swallowed by the pressure of attention. A fork hovered above a plate and didn't come down. Somewhere near the bar, a glass stopped mid-clink and remained suspended in a careful hand. Julian's eyes narrowed. He tried to recover with posture, leaning back as if he'd expected this all along. But his shoulders had tightened. The muscle at his jaw flexed once, a small betrayal. Aaliyah let a brief silence sit between them, long enough for his confidence to start slipping through it. Then she switched seamlessly into formal Parisian French, clean, aristocratic, academic, like turning a key in a different lock. "Our oysters are from Normandy," she said evenly. "Delivered this morning." Her voice held a soft resonance now, not louder, just fuller, the way it filled space when it didn't need permission. She didn't glance around to see who was watching. She already knew. Julian's lips parted, ready to dismiss her, to twist the moment back into his control. Aaliyah didn't let him. "But allow me," she added, still polite, "to correct your usage." Her right hand lowered her pen to the notepad. It touched the paper with a small, delicate tap, a sound so slight it should have disappeared except the room was silent enough to honor it. Julian blinked once. Aaliyah continued, her eyes steady on him. "You used a technical term as a flourish. Arnott Daniel would have used a different word in this context." She delivered the correction the way she might have delivered a citation, not as an insult, but as fact. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. That was what made it worse for him. A ripple moved through the dining room, tiny reactions contained in expensive bodies. Elena's hand rose to her mouth, not to hide laughter, but to keep herself from breathing too loudly. Toby, hovering nearby with a water pitcher, stared as if he'd forgotten he had feet. At the bar, Sasha's eyebrows lifted a fraction, admiration sharpening her face. In the kitchen pass, Marcel stepped forward just enough to be seen, arms folding across his chest, his mouth set in a fierce line that almost resembled a grin. Julian's face drained by degrees, as though someone had opened a valve. The color left his cheeks first, then his lips. He tried to speak, his mouth opened, closed, then opened again. No sound came out. Aaliyah's French stayed immaculate. She didn't rush. She didn't take the bait of his humiliation with extra words. She let the weight do its work. "The language you're using as a weapon," she said, "isn't a toy for impressing people." Julian's eyes sharpened with anger, the instinctive reflex of a man who had never been corrected without consequences. Aaliyah kept going, her voice smooth over steel. "It's the remnant of a history that tried to erase voices. I studied it for years. Properly." The last word landed cleanly. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Julian's fingers gripped the edge of the menu. Leather creaked softly. The sound was too intimate for a public loss. Elena's shoulders loosened a fraction, relief slipping through her posture before she could stop it. Her eyes didn't leave Aaliyah's face now. The apology from earlier had turned into something else: recognition. Maybe. Or envy. Or gratitude. It was hard to tell. Julian swallowed. His throat bobbed. He tried to assemble a smile again, tried to turn the moment into flirtation or banter, something he could sell. It didn't fit anymore. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, still courteous. "Which century would you like to dine in, sir?" The question was delivered like a menu option, the faintest edge of dark humor, sharpened and contained. A few people in the room exhaled through their noses, a restrained sound that wasn't quite laughter but wanted to be. Elena's mouth twitched, despite herself. Julian's eyes flashed. He hated that the room had heard it. He hated that it was funny. He hated that he couldn't punish her for it in the moment. He tried to speak in French, clipped and modern, as if retreating to a safer field. Just, he began. Aaliyah didn't interrupt. She waited, giving him the courtesy he hadn't given anyone. Julian's voice came out tighter than he intended. Just tell me the options. Aaliyah nodded once, the gesture professional, almost kind. She listed the oyster selections in plain contemporary French, then shifted to English without effort, offering accompaniments, sauces, the sort of service that had always been expected of her. The difference now was that everyone knew she was choosing to provide it not because she had to, but because she could. Julian's eyes stayed fixed on the table, avoiding the room. He ordered in short phrases, stripped of earlier theatricality. He did not meet Aaliyah's gaze again. Aaliyah wrote the order with steady strokes. The pen moved quietly, controlled. She tore the ticket with a clean motion, paper whispering as it separated. When she looked up, her expression was unchanged, calm, composed, unreadable. But Julian's face had become something else entirely. Not amused. Not superior. Cornered. And as Aaliyah stepped away with the order in hand, she felt it as surely as she felt the dampness under her heel. He wasn't finished. The kitchen air hit Aaliyah like a wall of heat and metal. Steam curled from open pans. A line cook called an order sharp enough to cut. Plates slid across the pass with practiced speed, porcelain warm against fingertips, the smell of butter and wine thick in the back of her throat. The ticket in her hand felt too light for what it had just cost her. Marcel took it from her without a word. His eyes met hers for a beat, and in that brief look there was something like approval, tight, controlled, fiercely earned. Then he turned away, barking instructions in French, the syllables snapping over the sizzle of the grill. Aaliyah exhaled slowly and forced her hands not to shake. The adrenaline that had kept her upright at the table was already draining, leaving a hollow ache behind her ribs. Her right heel throbbed where dampness had seeped into the split sole. She shifted her weight carefully, rolling it toward the left foot, then back, as if balance could be negotiated. At the server station, Victor appeared again, moving fast. His jaw clenched so hard it made a ridge beneath his cheekbone. "What did you do, Vance?" he hissed, low enough to keep it out of the dining room. Aaliyah kept her eyes on the screen, pretending to check table times. "I answered his question," she said evenly. Victor's nostrils flared. "You corrected him!" In front of the room. Aaliyah's fingers hovered above the keys. Then she typed in the oyster selection with precise taps, letting the small mechanical sound fill the space between them. Tap, tap, tap. Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping into something uglier. "Do you have any idea how much he's worth?" Aaliyah didn't look at him. "I know what he tried to do," she said. Victor stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language he couldn't afford to learn. He straightened his tie again, a reflex, then walked away with the stiff gait of a man trying not to panic. Aaliyah stood still for a moment, listening. From the dining room, the soft jazz returned, hesitant at first, then more confident as conversation resumed in cautious waves. The spell had broken, but the air had changed. People were speaking again, yet their voices carried a new thinness, as though the room had learned something about itself and didn't like the taste. When Aaliyah stepped back onto the carpet with the first course, she felt eyes follow her movement in a way they never had before. Not hungry eyes, not dismissive ones, curious, assessing. A room full of people suddenly aware the invisible staff might contain surprises. She placed the oysters at table 7 with careful hands. Ice cracked softly in the bed beneath the shells. A squeeze of lemon glistened like clear oil under candlelight. She set the mignonette down without spilling a drop. Julian did not look up when she arrived. He stared at his plate as if it were a problem he wanted to solve by refusing it. Elena lifted her fork, then paused, watching Aaliyah with a different expression now. Gratitude sat near the surface of her face, uncomfortable there, like jewelry she hadn't chosen. She glanced at Julian, then back at Aaliyah, and her lips parted as if she wanted to say something. She didn't. Julian picked up one shell, held it for a moment, then set it back down untouched. The motion was precise, almost delicate, but his fingers were too tight around the ridged edge. His knuckles had gone pale. Aaliyah kept her voice smooth. "Can I bring anything else for the table?" Julian's answer came in clipped modern French. No. The word was smaller than his earlier performance, stripped of ornament. It sounded like retreat. Aliyah nodded and stepped away. She could feel the tension pressing against the back of her neck as she left the table, like heat from an open oven. Through the next hour, service moved with the relentless rhythm of a machine. Plates went out. Plates came back. Glasses emptied and filled again. Candlelight wavered. The room tried to return to normal, but table 7 remained a knot in the fabric. Julian ate almost nothing. When the main course arrived, he cut a piece of meat and set it aside without lifting it to his mouth. He drank water instead of wine, as if afraid of losing further control. His jaw stayed tight, his gaze avoiding the room. Every so often his eyes would flick toward Aliyah when she passed, not to summon her, but to measure the distance between humiliation and revenge. Elena ate in silence, posture straight, hands careful. Once, when Aliyah refilled her water, Elena's fingers brushed the edge of the glass and trembled slightly. She didn't look up, but her shoulders loosened just a fraction when Aliyah moved away, as if the simple act of being treated with respect had shifted something inside her. At the server's station, Toby whispered when Aliyah passed him with a tray of bread. "That was insane," he breathed. "How did you?" Aliyah kept walking. "Don't," she murmured, not unkindly. "Not now." Her phone stayed heavy in her apron pocket. It didn't buzz again, but the earlier vibrations had left a phantom sensation against her thigh. Her thoughts kept snagging on the name Mrs. Higgins, on the idea of an unanswered call, on the image of her father's face in a fluorescent room. She swallowed the fear and kept moving. She couldn't afford to fall apart in a place designed to punish weakness. By the time she returned to table 7 with dessert menus, the candle had burned low, leaving a glossy pool of wax. The plates in front of Julian looked barely disturbed, as if the meal had happened around him rather than to him. Aliyah placed the dessert menus down gently. Julian waved them away without looking. "Just the check." His voice was flat, controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it. Not fear, something sharper. A man forcing the world back into a shape he recognized. Aliyah nodded and went to print it. The receipt slid out with a soft, dry whisper. She tucked it into the leather presenter and walked it back to the table. Julian took it from her hand too quickly, his fingers brushing her skin like an accusation. He pulled out a Platinum American Express card and placed it inside with a flick that was meant to feel careless. Aliyah picked it up, keeping her movements precise. "I'll be right back, sir." At the server station, the card felt cold in her palm. She swiped it, watched the screen process, listened to the small electronic hum of the terminal, the tiny beep that meant approval. Beep? She returned the card to the check holder with the receipt. Her hands shook now that she was out of Julian's direct line of sight. She forced them still, smoothing the leather edge once with her thumb. When she went back to the table, Julian signed with an aggressive slash. The pen scratched hard across paper. Elena gathered her clutch slowly, eyes down. Julian stood abruptly, chair legs scraping the carpet with a harsh, irritated sound. Aliyah stepped back to give him space. Julian's hand went to his jacket pocket, then his other pocket. His brows pulled together. Confusion passed over his face like a shadow, and then something darker replaced it. His voice rose, too loud for the room. "My card," he said. Heads turned. Julian's eyes snapped to Aliyah, sharp and bright with opportunity. "Where's my card?" Aliyah's stomach dropped, but her face stayed composed as if her muscles had learned the shape of calm by force. "Sir, she began, then stopped herself. The room had turned toward them in slow increments, like flowers, following light. Too many eyes, too much money, too much appetite for spectacle. Julian held the check presenter up as if it were evidence in a trial. His voice cut through the jazz, through the clink of silver, through the careful murmur of people who didn't want to be involved. "It's gone. My card is gone." Elena froze beside him, clutched tight in her hand. Her lips parted, then closed again. Her gaze flicked to the table, to the floor, anywhere but Aliyah's face. Aliyah kept her hands visible at her sides. She could feel dampness cooling her heel, could feel her pulse pressing against her throat. She forced her voice into an even tone. "I returned it to the holder, sir." "You signed. It should be." Julian slapped the check presenter down on the table. Leather hit linen with a flat, loud sound. Heads turned harder now. A man 2 tables away stopped chewing. A woman's laugh died mid-breath. "Someone took it," Julian said. His eyes narrowed, then snapped to Aaliyah with sudden certainty, as if he had been waiting for this opening all along. She was the last one to touch it. Victor appeared at the edge of the table almost instantly, drawn by the sound and the threat of an expensive scene. His smile was wide, brittle, and useless. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm certain there's been a misunderstanding." "There isn't," Julian interrupted, sharper now. He pointed at Aaliyah. She took it. Check her apron. Check her pockets. Aaliyah's blood went cold. For a fraction of a second, the room blurred at the edges. She saw not the dining room, but a fluorescent hallway, a plastic chair, a nurse's face that wouldn't meet her eyes, the smell of bleach, her father's name on a clipboard, the envelope on her kitchen counter, thin enough to fold in half without resistance. She swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't take." "You humiliated me," Julian hissed, stepping closer. His voice dropped, but the room was quiet enough that people still heard the edges of it. "Did you think I'd let that go?" His breath smelled faintly of mint and wine. His eyes burned with something ugly, something that had nothing to do with a credit card. "You think because you memorized some dead language you're better than me?" he continued, the words spilling faster now. "You're a thief. You're exactly what you look like. Check her, Victor, now, or I'll have your job too." Victor's face drained. His gaze snapped to Aaliyah's apron, then to Julian, then to the surrounding tables where diners watched with the careful excitement of people witnessing someone else's disaster. "Miss Vance," Victor said, voice tight, "if you would just to clear this up." Aaliyah's hands curled once, then forced themselves open. She knew what this was, not a misunderstanding, not concern, a punishment dressed as procedure. Toby stood a few steps away, still holding a pitcher, his mouth slightly open. His eyes were wide with horror, and he looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to speak inside a room full of power. At the bar, Sasha's fingers gripped the edge so hard her knuckles went white. She shook her head once, a small, furious movement that didn't change anything. From the kitchen doors, Marcel pushed out into the dining room, shoulders squared, arms tense at his sides. His eyes locked on Julian with open contempt. He looked like a man ready to intervene and already aware he might be stopped. Aaliyah took one step back, not away from guilt, but away from the shape of the trap closing. Her heel slid slightly on the carpet. The split sole caught, then released. The tiny, damp squeak was almost inaudible, except the room had grown so silent it could have been a confession. Julian's mouth twisted. "Hear that?" he said, loud again. "She's nervous. She knows." Aaliyah's heart hammered. She fought to keep her breathing steady. She could feel the floor tilt under the weight of what a single accusation could do here. This was how people like Julian won. Not with truth, with volume, certainty, and the assumption that the room would side with money. Victor reached toward Aaliyah's apron, hesitating, fingers trembling slightly. Aaliyah's chest tightened. If he touched her, if he made her turn out her pockets in front of these people, something would break in her that she might never get back. Dignity wasn't a luxury for her. It was the last possession she had that couldn't be billed by the hour. Her phone, pressed against her thigh, suddenly vibrated, one sharp pulse like a warning. She didn't look down. She couldn't. Not now. Julian leaned closer, voice low, venomous. "Go ahead," he said. "Show them. Empty your pockets. Prove you're not what you are." Aaliyah's lips parted. No words came out. Her mind flashed to her father again, to his left side slack, to the way his eyes sometimes drifted as if he were looking for her in a room she couldn't enter. Then a voice cut through the tension, calm, cold, and unmistakably in control. "That won't be necessary." Every head turned. At table 4, the gray-haired gentleman rose with unhurried grace. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and he moved like the room belonged to him without needing to prove it. As he stepped forward, people leaned back instinctively, creating a path as if their bodies recognized authority before their minds did. He approached table 7, gaze fixed on Julian, not on Aaliyah. Julian's brows drew together, irritation flaring. "This is a private matter." The gentleman's eyes lifted slightly, and the irritation in Julian's face faltered as if he'd hit an invisible wall. "I believe," the man said quietly, "you are causing a scene over a credit card you claim was stolen." Julian's jaw clenched. It was stolen. By her. The gentleman's gaze shifted briefly to Aaliyah, pale blue, sharp, assessing. Something passed across his face recognition, quickly masked. Then his eyes returned to Julian. "I see," he said. "And you're quite certain it was taken." Julian lifted his chin, grateful for the chance to perform again. "I put it in the holder. She took it to process payment. When it came back, the card was gone. The math isn't complicated." The gentleman nodded slowly, as if humoring a child. "Indeed, mathematics rarely are," he said. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, have you checked your own pockets?" Julian's nostrils flared. "Of course I." "Humor me," the man said. It wasn't a request. Julian's hand went to his jacket again with exaggerated annoyance. He patted the outer pockets, then the inner pocket, ready to prove his point. His fingers stopped. His face changed. Slowly, like a man pulling something burning from his own chest, Julian reached into his inner breast pocket and drew out a platinum American Express card. The room exhaled as one. Julian stared at the card as if it had betrayed him. His mouth opened, searching for an explanation, but nothing formed fast enough to save him. The gentleman's eyebrow lifted slightly. "How remarkably convenient," he said, voice mild, almost conversational. And in that mildness, Julian's power began to collapse. The platinum card sat in Julian's fingers like a dead thing. For a moment he didn't move, as if the simple act of holding it might undo him further. His eyes darted from the card to the check presenter on the table, then to Aaliyah, searching for a way to shove the humiliation back onto her. The room gave him nothing. Too many witnesses. Too much silence. The gray-haired gentleman kept his tone gentle, which made it worse. "It appears the card was never stolen at all," he said. "It appears it was misplaced, conveniently timed, conveniently loud." Julian's throat worked. He swallowed. The color returned to his face in an ugly flush, climbing from his neck to his cheeks. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if words were suddenly expensive. Victor stood beside the table with his hands half raised, frozen between apology and obedience. His tie looked tighter now, as if it were choking him. Elena had stepped farther away, just a small shift, but enough to change the geometry. Her gaze stayed on Julian, not with sympathy, but with a kind of dawning clarity. The ruby earrings at her ears caught the candlelight and flashed like warning lights. Aaliyah kept her hands at her sides. Her fingers tingled, blood rushing back into them. She could feel her heartbeat in her palms. The dampness in her right heel had cooled into a steady chill. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The gentleman's presence had placed the room under new rules, and she didn't yet know what those rules would cost. The gentleman angled his head slightly, studying Julian the way a banker studied a contract. "Publicly accusing an employee of theft," he said softly, "immediately after she refused to be humiliated for your entertainment. That is an interesting coincidence." Julian's jaw clenched. I mean. "This is ridiculous. It must have fallen into your pocket during the confusion," the gentleman supplied. His voice remained polite, almost amused. The kind of amusement that never softened into mercy. Julian's eyes flashed with anger, then quickly cooled into calculation. He straightened his shoulders, tried to reclaim posture as if posture could erase what had just happened. "Sir," he began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure we can." "No." The single word landed cleanly. Not loud, not dramatic, final. The gentleman's pale blue eyes didn't blink. "You will not bargain your way out of this?" he continued, still conversational. "You will apologize to this woman and you will leave. Permanently." Julian's face shifted, disbelief cracking his expression. "Your establishment doesn't. Who are you?" The gentleman glanced toward the entrance as if the answer were painted there. Then his gaze returned to Julian, calm and cold. "My name is on the door, Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Surely even you noticed." The words struck the room like a bell. Aaliyah felt something in the air change tiny, precise, irreversible. A few diners leaned back in their chairs as if they had suddenly remembered they were not the most powerful people in the room. At the bar, Sasha exhaled through her nose, a sound that was almost a laugh but held too much relief. Julian's face drained again, faster this time. Pieces assembled behind his eyes, Rothwell Lounge, the name he had barely acknowledged, the way people had shifted when the gentleman stood. Not a random patron, not a concerned bystander. Maximilian Rothwell. Aaliyah watched Julian realize it, watched the arrogance in his posture buckle under the weight of recognition. "Mr. Rothwell," Julian said quickly, voice changing shape into something smoother. "I apologize. I didn't realize you were present." Rothwell's expression did not change. "You didn't realize I was watching," he said. "When you used language like a toy to humiliate my employee? Or you didn't realize I was present when you manufactured a theft accusation to retaliate against her?" His tone stayed even, which made every word feel sharpened. "I'm curious which ignorance you're claiming." Julian's fingers tightened around the card. He forced a small laugh that died immediately in the air. "This is being blown out of proportion. I'm under a lot of stress. Mistakes happen." Rothwell looked at the card, then at Julian. "Mistakes do happen," he agreed, repeatedly. Strangely. Always in the direction of cruelty. Elena's hand moved to her left ring finger. Not to adjust her jewelry, to feel whether it was still there. Aaliyah's phone buzzed once inside her apron, a hard, sudden pulse that made her stomach twist. She didn't look down, but the vibration dragged her mind away for a split second. An envelope on a counter, thin paper, 2 words written in thick marker. "Dad Fund." The phrase came with a smell in her memory. Radiator dust and cold takeout, the cramped air of a studio apartment that never stopped feeling temporary. The thought hit her with blunt force. She couldn't lose this job. She couldn't lose tonight's tips. She couldn't lose the next week, the next month, the next chance to keep her father from slipping farther away. Rothwell's eyes shifted toward her, just briefly, as if he could see the stakes under her silence. Then his gaze returned to Julian. "You will apologize," Rothwell said, "and you will leave." Julian's lips pulled back slightly, irritation leaking through his controlled mask. "And if I don't?" Rothwell's hand moved to his cufflink, adjusting it with casual precision. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of someone used to moving markets with a phone call. "Then we discuss consequences," he said mildly. Julian's eyes narrowed. "What consequences?" "This is a restaurant." Rothwell's gaze stayed steady. "It is also a name," he replied. "A name attached to institutions you benefit from." Julian's breathing changed, a fraction faster, a fraction louder. Aaliyah saw it in his eyes the moment he recognized that this was no longer about embarrassment. It was about control, and he no longer held it. Rothwell's tone softened only in the way ice softened when it began to melt. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, Mr. Blackwood." Julian looked at Aaliyah then, really looked at her, and something ugly moved behind his eyes, humiliation sharpening into hatred, hatred searching for a weapon. Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her hands remained still. Her face remained neutral. But inside her, the envelope waited. The phone buzz still echoed in her thigh. The truth of her life pressed against her ribs like a locked door. Rothwell waited, and the room waited with him. Rothwell let the silence do what shouting never could. Julian's mouth opened on instinct, ready to push back with the same entitlement that had carried him through every room he'd ever entered. But the room had shifted around him. The diners weren't watching Aaliyah anymore. They were watching him, measuring how quickly money could turn into embarrassment when it chose the wrong target. Julian tried to steady himself with charm. "Mr. Rothwell," he said, voice controlled, smooth, "too late. I'm sure we can resolve this privately." Rothwell's gaze stayed on him as if Julian were a line item on a balance sheet. "Privately" implies there's something here worth concealing. A faint ripple moved through the room, restrained, careful, the kind of reaction wealthy people made when they wanted to be entertained but didn't want to be recorded enjoying it. Julian's eyes flicked to Aaliyah again, then away, his jaw tightening. He lifted the platinum card as if it could be turned into a prop that proved he'd been wronged, not exposed. "It was missing," he insisted. "Anyone would assume." "Anyone who wanted to assume," Rothwell corrected, tone mild. "Your assumption was immediate. Your accusation was public. Your purpose was obvious." Victor stood a step behind Aaliyah now, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles shone. He looked like a man trying to disappear into his own suit. Aaliyah's phone buzzed once more, short and sharp, like a warning shot. She forced her face to remain blank. She could feel the vibration fade into heat against her thigh and leave behind a cold fear that didn't have words yet. Rothwell's attention shifted, just slightly, to Victor. "Call the police," was suggested rather enthusiastically, he said. "Was that your standard procedure here, Victor? Or was it reserved for moments when your guests demand a public sacrifice?" Victor swallowed. "Mr. Rothwell, I." Rothwell raised a hand. "Not to silence, to set a boundary. We can address management failures later. Right now, we address the man who decided a woman's dignity was optional." Julian's nostrils flared. "This is absurd. I made a mistake." Rothwell tilted his head a fraction. "A mistake is spilling wine. A mistake is mispronouncing a dish. What you attempted was punishment." Julian's smile cracked. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if proximity could create authority. "You're overreacting. She embarrassed me in front of my fiancé." Rothwell's gaze didn't move. "And you attempted to ruin her livelihood in front of an entire room." Julian's eyes sharpened. "Don't pretend this is about morality. This is about reputation." Rothwell's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes cooled further. "Then let's speak in the language you understand." The phrase landed like a switch being flipped. Rothwell's hand moved inside his jacket. For a brief, electric moment, the room tensed, an instinctive fear of what power might produce. But he only withdrew a slim leather card case. He opened it with a quiet click and held it up just long enough for the gold embossing to catch the candlelight. "Rothwell Financial Group." Julian stared, and his throat tightened visibly. Rothwell closed the case again, slow and deliberate. "Sterling Capital's debt obligations are not a rumor, Mr. Blackwood. They are a schedule." Julian's voice came out thinner. "Those are standard arrangements." Rothwell nodded. "Standard terms, yes, with standard remedies." He looked at Julian the way a man looked at a door he could open with a key. 18 million in quarterly repayments to the Rothwell Consortium, if memory serves, due on the 15th of each month. Julian's face went still, too still. His eyes didn't blink. Rothwell continued without raising his voice. "Section 7. Paragraph 3 of your agreement includes a clause regarding moral turpitude and reputational risk to the lending institution." Victor's breath caught audibly. A server near the bar froze with a tray, then slowly stepped back as if afraid of breaking something fragile. Julian forced a laugh that sounded like air escaping a puncture. "You can't be serious." Rothwell's fingers adjusted his cufflink again, a small metallic glint. "I assure you, I am." Julian's skin went pale beneath the flush. "You can't call my credit lines over." Over publicly accusing an employee of theft in my establishment, Rothwell finished. Over attempting to weaponize law enforcement as personal revenge. Over creating a reputational hazard that reflects directly on institutions that lend to you. Yes, I can. Julian's lips pressed into a hard line. His eyes flicked to the surrounding tables. The audience wasn't neutral anymore. It was hungry. Elena's hand moved slowly to her engagement ring. Her thumb traced the band once, as if testing whether it belonged to her or to the life she'd been promised. Rothwell turned slightly toward Aaliyah, just enough to include her without making her a spectacle. His voice softened by a degree, not from sentiment but from precision. "Miss Vance," he said, "you will not be searched. You will not be questioned. You will not be treated as a suspect in a crime that did not occur." Aaliyah's lungs unclenched in a single, silent release. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The relief was too sharp, too immediate, like stepping out of freezing water and realizing you'd been numb. Rothwell's eyes returned to Julian. "I will give you a choice." The room leaned in without moving. "You may apologize to Miss Vance with sincerity," Rothwell said, "and leave quietly. We will consider tonight an unfortunate lapse in judgment." Julian's jaw flexed. "And the other choice?" Rothwell's tone remained calm. "You continue protesting and I make a phone call. Your credit lines will be frozen by Monday morning." Julian stared at him, hatred and fear fighting behind his eyes, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. A man who had always believed consequences were for other people suddenly faced the math of his own leverage. Elena's fingers slipped under the ring. She lifted it off with careful slowness, the diamond catching candlelight one last time. The ring touched the table with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Julian turned toward her, shocked. Elena. She didn't look at him. Her voice was quiet, steady, and relieved in a way that made it final. I'll call a car. She walked toward the exit without looking back, her heels whispering over carpet. Julian reached out as if he could grab her with a word. Elena, wait. She was already gone. The room stayed silent as the door closed behind her. Then all that silence returned to Julian, pressing in from every side. Rothwell waited. Julian's gaze snapped to Aaliyah, and the hatred in his eyes tried to harden into something he could use. But his voice, when it finally came, was smaller than he intended. I apologize, he said. Rothwell didn't react. To her, he said simply. Julian's throat worked. His eyes stayed on Aaliyah's shoes for a heartbeat, as if he needed to remind himself of the hierarchy he'd lost. Then he lifted his gaze to her face. The words scraped out of him like broken glass. I'm sorry. Julian's apology hung in the air like something dropped, not offered. Aaliyah said nothing. Her face remained composed, but her pulse was loud in her ears, a steady drum that refused to match the calm she projected. She watched him the way you watched, a man holding a lit match near dry paper, waiting to see whether he would snuff it out or throw it. Rothwell held Julian's gaze for a long beat, measuring the sincerity that wasn't there. That will do, he said, not unkindly, but without softness. Now leave. Julian's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, then back, as if he couldn't accept that the room no longer belonged to him. The diners had resumed breathing, but no one looked away. Wealthy faces stayed carefully blank, the way people looked at a crash they would later describe as inevitable. Julian reached for the check presenter with sudden, unnecessary force. The leather case scraped against linen. He shoved it under his arm like it was evidence he planned to use later. His attention snapped to Victor, searching for an ally, a loophole, anyone he could still control. Victor's lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him could open. Julian's nostrils flared. This is he, began, then stopped. He knew better now than to argue with someone who spoke in clauses. Rothwell stepped slightly to the side, giving Julian a clear path to the exit. The gesture was almost courteous. It was also a dismissal. Julian moved, but not smoothly. His shoulders stayed tight, his steps shorter than they had been when he entered. His polished shoes made no sound on the carpet, yet Aaliyah could sense every footfall through the stillness. His body carried the rigid energy of a man trying not to run. As he passed Aaliyah, Julian's gaze flicked down, one last attempt to reclaim the old hierarchy by noticing her shoes again. The split sole, the scuffing, the damp edge that had betrayed her earlier. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a snarl. Aaliyah didn't move. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't offer him a single gesture of comfort. Julian's mouth opened as if he wanted to say something else, something sharper, something that would make the apology feel less like surrender. But Rothwell's presence held him in place like gravity. He swallowed it and kept walking. The dining room stayed silent until the door closed behind him. The final latch sounded like a period. For a beat, no one spoke. Even the jazz seemed thinner, embarrassed by its own return. Then Rothwell turned toward Aaliyah. His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The hard edge he'd used on Julian softened into something more human, more attentive, not sentimental, focused. Miss Vance, he said quietly, would you join me in the office? Victor flinched as if the words had struck him physically. He opened his mouth. Mr. Rothwell, Rothwell didn't look at him. Later, Victor. Victor closed his mouth. His shoulders slumped. A man relieved not to be fired in public and terrified of what private would bring. Aaliyah's phone vibrated again in her apron pocket, one long buzz this time. Her breath caught. She kept her face neutral, but the inside of her chest tightened around a single thought. Her father. Rothwell noticed the micro-shift in her posture, the way her fingers curled once and released. His gaze didn't pry. It simply acknowledged. It won't be long, he said, voice low enough that it felt like an assurance rather than an order. Aaliyah nodded once. She followed Rothwell through the dining room. People made space again, chairs shifting softly, napkins adjusted, eyes sliding away when she passed. She wasn't invisible anymore. The change was disorienting. like walking into sunlight after being underground. Near the bar, Sasha met Aaliyah's eyes and gave a small, fierce nod. Marcel stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, his expression set. He didn't smile, but his gaze held something like pride. Toby's face was flushed, astonished, his lips parted as if he'd been holding a cheer inside his mouth. Aaliyah kept walking. The hallway to the office was quieter, warmer, lined with framed photographs and wine awards. The carpet here was thicker, swallowing footsteps completely. The air smelled less like food and more like leather and old paper. Rothwell opened a door and gestured her inside. The office was small but elegant, lined with framed accolades and black and white photographs of celebrities who had once eaten at tables that now felt far away. A single desk sat beneath a shaded lamp that cast a pool of amber light. The room hummed faintly with the sound of a server closet nearby, a low mechanical vibration like distant breathing. Alia stood for a moment, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether sitting would feel like surrender. Rothwell took a seat first, not to claim dominance, but to make the room predictable. He motioned to the chair opposite him. "Please," he said. Aaliyah sat. The leather was soft, cooler than her skin, and it made her feel more aware of the sweat drying at her collar. Rothwell folded his hands on the desk. His cufflinks caught the lamplight, small silver flashes. 2 years ago, he said without preamble, I attended a symposium at the Sorbonne. Aaliyah's breath stopped. Rothwell's eyes stayed on hers, steady and precise. You presented research on language as a colonial weapon, post-revolutionary linguistic erasure in southern France. Aaliyah's throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice yet. The world she had buried lecture halls, marble atriums, professors who used her surname with respect rose up like it had been waiting behind a door. Rothwell continued, and his tone changed again, softer in a way that carried recognition rather than pity. You were extraordinary. Aaliyah's hands trembled. She slid them under the edge of the chair, hiding the shake in the shadows. Rothwell leaned forward slightly. I asked Professor Dubois for your contact information. I wanted to offer you a position at my foundation. Aaliyah swallowed. I withdrew, she managed, the words barely audible. My father. I know, Rothwell said. The simplicity of it hit harder than sympathy ever could. No questions, no demands for proof, just knowledge. He paused, then added, I have been trying to locate you ever since. Aaliyah's eyes stung. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, urgent, and the sound felt like a countdown. Rothwell's gaze dropped briefly to the apron at her waist, then lifted back to her face. Tonight, he said, I finally found you. And Aaliyah realized, with a sudden dizzy clarity, that Julian's collapse had only been the beginning.